So today, I'm going to talk about building next generation of CMOs. Sounds not too exciting, but I actually think it is. When I stumbled into Facebook, it was at a time where we set up this new thing called growth, and it was something that most folks had never heard about before. Actually, it didn't exist. We were sort of faced with this challenge of building and scaling a type of company that had never existed before. So we realized we can't approach the problem using traditional means. We need to be creative, develop a team that took ownership of growth within the organization, ownership of growth from a metrics perspective, and made that successful in a way that was very different than how traditional companies grow. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Quick background was at Facebook from 100 million to 500 million users, Twitter from about 20 to 130. Spent some time there with Mr. Ellman. That was a lot of fun. I was at Quora very, very early on. Sort of got involved at the days in which initial growth was driven by all of us employees actually creating the content. So that's how we got that off the ground, up to a size that is meaningful but undisclosed, because they like to keep everything, just heads down and focused. Spent some time at Greylock as an entrepreneur in residence, also with Josh Ellman again, focusing on helping Greylock portfolio companies figure out their growth efforts. Currently, I'm at Wealthfront, where I'm the Director of Growth and Revenue, and we're building the next generation financial services company, trying to democratize sophisticated investing for everyone. Joined when we had $300 million of folks' money that we're managing on their behalf, and today we have over $2.3 billion. And still growing. But yeah, folks get fired up about that. That's right. We're going after a huge industry, and it needs change. All right, so what is growth? Let's start with the basics. This is the most common question I get. And I actually like to talk about the comparison or the analogy to a finance organization within a company. So let's talk about finance, right? Finance, they pay attention to the flow of capital in and out of a business, right? And when they're paying attention to that flow, they use that information to contribute to all sorts of really meaningful business decisions, whether it's the real estate that you choose to move into, from a garage into a 10,000 square foot office, into something much more than that, to the hiring decisions and the pace at which you're able to bring people into the company, strategic acquisitions, what you can buy, can you buy, and for how much, and compensation programs. They make a lot of really important contributions to the business. But what's interesting is every single company, eventually when discussing how we make money, comes to the realization that the single biggest lever they have for maximizing the revenue potential for the business is the number of users or customers you have, right? It's a function of scale. Everything is a secondary optimization of scale, right? The sort of advertising products you build are only so effective insofar as you have massive scale. But what's ironic about that, and getting to the cart before the horse analogy, is if scale of users or customers is the single biggest lever for driving revenue potential, then why don't you have a team paying attention to the flow of users or customers in and out of your product in the same way that you have a finance team paying attention to the flow of capital in and out of your business? That just doesn't make sense. And so that's largely, I think, what precipitated the creation of growth at Facebook and now growth organizations within multiple companies. And it's pretty exciting to be a part of that. And what's interesting is when I look at sort of the evolving role of marketing and chief marketing officers within companies is the last 5 years is we've seen tremendous sort of shakeup, right? And the shifting of roles and responsibilities between marketing and growth. If you look at Best Buy, I think recently they had a more traditional CMO that departed, and they replaced that with a CMO that I think came from AutoNation, has a consumer internet background, and all of a sudden you have a chief marketing officer that can talk about the statistics related to A/B testing and experimentation. And that's really different, right? When you think of what is necessary for a business like Macy's or JCPenney's or all the traditional brick and mortar entities, they grew in an entirely different way. And the sort of person that you needed at the helm of growth, the skills that they had and their mentality was very, very different than what we see today. There's a guy named Alex Schultz who's the VP of growth at Facebook, and he has a master's in experimental physics from Cambridge. Right? He's a trained scientist. Right? And then you put him into an environment in which he needs to control for variables within some experiment and measure the output of that. Like, you take him from titrating lasers and put him into titrating the rate at which people add friends at Facebook, and he's pretty damn good at it. So that's the shift that's happening. And I want to talk about, from what I've experienced, the three main disciplines or areas of work that you need to develop in order to become that next generation CMO. I'll talk about two of these in detail. The first is building data models and your ability to organize people around those data models and using simple data models to express how your company grows. The second is building rigorous experimentation programs. The last is developing new customer acquisition channels. I'm not going to talk about that one very much because I don't know if there's too much to say about it other than try and build new channels. If some work, then make them even better over time. If they don't, then abandon it and cut to the next one. So let's talk about the first two. Number one is building growth models. It dawned on me one day that I'm a bit of like a science and sci-fi nerd, and it dawned on me one day that it was really fascinating that we can have these really simple equations that express profound bits of information about the world around us. Stuff like E equals MC squared can explain the fundamental laws of the universe. But then when I was chatting with most companies, I'd ask them, how do you grow right now? And 30 minutes later, I still wasn't sure exactly how it grew or whether or not they actually understood that. And the realization I had was that, like, every single company, in order to be successful at driving growth and implementing that organizationally within a company, needs to actually have a simple expression for how they grow. And the simple expression is important because you want everyone at the company to understand how you grow, so that in their day-to-day decision-making, they're much more effective. Because why wouldn't you want everyone at your startup to understand how you grow and succeed? So the first is building growth models. This is actually, Dave mentioned I worked for a guy named Chamath, who's a VP of growth at Facebook, and he now runs a Social Plus Capital partnership. But I learned this from him, and I've carried this with me. He's spoken about this before publicly. But this is the basic growth equation that he uses. This is something that I live by in terms of assessing the potential of any business, whether I'm going to invest in it or join it. And it's a simple ABC. A is the top of funnel. Top of funnel is pretty descriptive. You know, can you get traffic, and can you convert that traffic into some meaningful usage? B is your magic moment. The most common magic moment that folks sort of talk about in legend of growth is this interesting statistic of if Facebook could get you to add 10 friends within the first 7 days after signing up, it was almost guaranteed that you'd be hooked. It was almost guaranteed that you'd be hooked because all of a sudden you saw this feed that was the aggregate of your entire social life, and that was the magic moment, and you found that interesting. For Wealthfront, I was using the product 8 months before I joined. And the whole promise of Wealthfront is that through transparency and automation, they can give you a great financial product. And so I signed up, opened an account, put money in. It started to invest my money. I went to bed one night, woke up the next morning, and it had taken some actions on my behalf and harvested like $3,000 in capital losses for me, which I could use for tax season. And then it just dawned on me. I was like, I didn't do anything. I didn't pay anything. I wasn't upsold on anything. I didn't have to pick up my phone and drill into my advisor and tell that person to go do something. It just did it. And that's a magic moment. All right, that's something that ignites some emotional response as a user of that product. And you must have that. What was it like the first time you hopped into an Uber? I remember, right? Like, Uber picked me up. The guy said, hey, Andy, gave me a bottle of water. It was a black car, and I'm sitting in the back. My friends were looking at me like I was a badass. I didn't know what was going on. It was the first time I'd used it. And then I popped out, and he says, have a good day, and took off. My friends looked at me, and I was like, what was that? Like, I'm never taking a taxi again. That's what I mean by magic moment. So in the early product development stages, you have to have that at the core. What is that magic experience? And then C is core product value. This one's a bit more nebulous, but it goes back to your thesis around your business. And increasingly over time, you have to continue to invest in core product value. And generally what happens is you see really healthy organic growth as the leading indicator that you got the core product value right. And what you'll find in this equation is that A usually becomes easier when you get B and C right. So I think the pitfall for you to avoid is tackling A first when you haven't invested enough in B and C. But you can make this more tactical. At every business, again, I think you can generate some simple algebraic expression of how you grow. I've never worked at Amazon, but when I look at their business, this is how I think about it. Right? There are a couple variables in this equation that expresses Amazon's growth. You could say that vertical expansion is the first one, right? So when Amazon launched, they began with just books, right? And they did books extremely well. But they began with that vertical. And so you could say that their growth rate as a business is proportional to the growth rate of their growth within that one vertical. So if they wanted to grow more, launch more verticals, which they eventually did going into music and so on. So that's variable number one. You can build an organization whose sole responsibility is to figure out what verticals do we move into and how, and then execute on that. The second variable is, what is the product inventory per vertical? Right? You can sell 10,000 books or you can sell 1 million. Obviously, if you can sell 1 million books, your potential for growth increases proportional to that. All of a sudden, you can set up a team whose function is to figure out what inventory should I build within this vertical and at what depth and in what priority order. And you can make that sort of efficient. You can operationalize that. And then all of a sudden, you realize we have a lot of verticals, and we have a lot of products, a lot of product depth within that vertical. And each one of these pages that represents a product is capable of earning traffic, whether that's indexable in a search engine and it receives traffic from Google, or I run ads towards that, or it's shared, whatever the case may be. And let's imagine that each product page got 1 visit on average per week. Well, what if you could set up a team that could increase that to 2? You could have massive impact on that business. That's an internet marketing organization. Maybe that's an SEO team. Maybe it's paid acquisition. And then moving on from that, there's a team that focuses on the conversion to purchase, the conversion to the purchase amount, the average amount, and then sort of the predictive rate at which people will come back. Like think about Amazon Prime. That's sort of the glue that stitches everything together and gets people to come back and buy more and more and more. So when that's said, you can take a step back and say, you know what, this is a really simple way of taking a gigantic business, expressing it in a basic way that everyone can understand, and that we can assign resources and priority towards those and we can execute. And the best litmus test here is if anyone is working on something that doesn't impact those, they're probably doing the wrong thing, right? And this is to my point around organizing people around parts of the equation. You know, growth at Wealthfront. We have our own simple equation. We understand what helps us drive the acquisition of more clients who invest more of their assets with us. And then we can align parts of the organization to each part of the equation. Now I want to talk about experimentation in a way that I haven't seen talked about very often. I think one of the classic descriptions around how you should test is that you should move fast and produce a bunch of small wins and allow those wins to compound and pile on top of each other. And the math behind that is very clear. And it's compound interest 101. If I'm investing my money, do I want to earn 5% per year on my money over 30 years or 6%? I want 6%. That may mean I retire with hundreds of thousands of additional dollars, right? And the same is true for growth, but it's not always true in terms of the experiments you select, the design of those experiments, and the priority of the experiments that you choose. All right, and so this is the behavior that large companies like to fall into. And they can because they have a ton of traffic, right? If I'm Facebook and I have 500 million daily unique visitors, or whatever the statistic may be, it's probably like close to 1 billion now. I can run a 1% sample across multiple parts of my product, and inside of 24 hours, I have 100% confidence on the results. Most of us in this room cannot do that, right? The number one limitation that we face is a sample size limitation, statistically. So this is actually what testing needs to look like. Small companies, and sorry, this isn't the most scientific graph, so let me explain what this means. So there's a function called thoughtfulness that's on one axis, and thoughtfulness could be, how much have you thought about the consumer psychology of the test and how you're trying to manipulate that? How much data have you looked at to inform whether or not this is a meaningful opportunity? And then you have sample size on the bottom. Sample size in statistical terms is just how much traffic you have, right? The number of samples per bucket that I'm able to push. And what large companies do is sits in this sort of lower right quadrant, right? You're like, I have so much traffic, and so my intrinsic behavior is to use that massive sample to my benefit. And generally what that means is I come up with a bunch of small ideas really quickly because statistically I can resolve on those tests really quickly, right? And so it's easy for my behavior to be shaped by the statistics behind it. Again, I can run that 1% sample A/B test and conclude on that 24 hours later. And if I'm Facebook and I can do that hundreds of times in a year, I may produce success. Small companies cannot do that, though. Small companies sit in this sort of upper left quadrant, right, where you have to be extremely thoughtful around experiment selection and design. And I'm going to get into some very specific examples of the impact. So scenario one is, like, let's look at the data behind producing small and large lifts on a sample of traffic, right? So column one is your base conversion rate. So if you had 100 people go to your homepage and 3 signed up, that's a 3% conversion rate. That's your base rate. And then column two, the one that I lit up in green, that's the dimension that we're changing. So let's imagine that in example A, you produce a 5% lift. Example B is a 10% lift. Example C is a 30% lift. Column C is where it gets interesting. And this is using actual traffic data from a startup that I helped. When you look at the required sample size per variant, in order to conclude on that test at 95% confidence, and the number of test days required, it tells a story, right? In the 3% base conversion rate with a 5% lift over that control, it'll take 72,000 samples per bucket and about 72 days to resolve that A/B test. If you're a small company, it is not worth spending 72 days to get a 5% lift. All right, everyone talks about pace of experimentation in the world of growth. If you're limited by sample size, you're handcuffed to begin with, right? But this sample of data tells you something interesting. If all of a sudden you produce a 30% lift, all you need is 2,200 samples, and you can resolve that test in 2 days. Then you have control over the pace of experimentation. So the lesson here is, if you're a small company and you're running A/B tests, don't change buttons, don't change button colors, don't try small shit. Go big. Go really big. If you're a SaaS product and you have some tiered pricing page, rip it apart. Completely change it. Try something totally different. Because even if it's 30% worse, you'll know in 2 days, and you can turn it off. If it's 30% better, you'll know in 2 days, and you succeed. That is the behavior that you want to shape, and the statistics behind it drives that. Let's talk about another scenario. So base conversion rates. What happens if you have a larger base conversion rate? Generally, you have a larger base conversion rate when you look deeper into the funnel, right? So I said, what if you had 100 visits to your homepage, 3 people signed up, that's a 3% conversion rate. What if you looked a little bit deeper in the funnel, maybe 3/4 of the way down, and you only had 10 people left and 3 of those signed up? You have 30% base conversion rate, right? So that's what I'm talking about. So as you look deeper in the funnel, another interesting story pops up. You assume the same percent change over the control, 10%, that's second column. And then you look at the third and the fourth column in terms of the required sample size and the test days needed. Same story, right? And so it tells you even more. If I'm going to run tests as a small startup, running tests at the top of the funnel is precarious because your base conversion rate is so low. Look deep into the funnel. If I'm a SaaS product, don't test the homepage. Go to like the second to last step before somebody gives you your credit card or chooses an account tier at which they want to subscribe for your product. Test there. See if you can get them to commit more capital up front. And if you can produce that 20% lift over the base, all the better. All right, so that's the summary of it. Pick your spot in the funnel wisely. The data behind it actually drives decision-making, and it drives behavior. And what some big companies do really well, and I think it was one of the Google co-founders, like he said when he's chatting with the team, if they only have 5 and 10% lift ideas, he knows that they're only doing as well as their competitors are. And he asks them, what's your 100% idea, right? Large companies need to maintain that behavior as well, and oftentimes they forget it because they fall trapped to having large sample sizes, and that drives their behavior to run a bunch of small tests. A couple final thoughts. These are sort of core lessons that over the last 8 years of working on growth, I've sort of pulled apart. And I just want to share those. I don't get to talk that often, and I want to take a moment to be a bit more genuine and just really tell you what I think, and also tell you a couple quick stories. Number one, you can't sustainably grow something that sucks. You can attempt to, but that's generally called spam. I don't think anyone here wants to be a spammer professionally. That's not fun. No, for Dave. Okay, Dave wants to, all right. Number 2, career growth is proportional to company growth. When I joined Facebook, I reported into a person who was a level 1 manager. I was the second hire. Today, he's a vice president that runs like a 200-person organization. If you want career growth, you have to choose companies where you can grow into increasing roles of responsibility because the business itself grows, right? And that's sort of tangential to number 1. You can't sustainably grow something that sucks. And if you're working on something that sucks, you can't scale your career. Growth careers, number 3, growth careers begin with focus, not generalization. I think it's probably the biggest mistake I see from folks who come into growth is they try and work on all aspects of growth at the same time from day 1. And then what you end up doing is you're okay at a lot of things, but you're not exceptional at any. The way that the psychology of management works is, let's say I'm scaling a company and new opportunities arise, and I run through that mental Rolodex of like, who at this company should I put in charge of this new area of responsibility? I don't think about the generalist who's okay at a lot of things. I think about that one person who just absolutely crushed that one thing they focused on, because I can trust that person to step into this new opportunity and crush that as well. When I moved to the Silicon Valley about 8 years ago, I stopped into the Barnes & Nobles on University Avenue in Palo Alto. I bought a book called SEO for Dummies. And I took that to University Cafe, and I read that. And I spent the first 2 years of my career working on SEO, and that was it. The expansion of opportunities happens after that. It's no different than the vertical optimization of Amazon's business. You have to vertically align your skills over time. Don't start with being okay at a lot of things, because you don't progress that way. Number 4, probably the most meaningful. Know your story, live a story. And I actually think that this is probably the most important part of being that NextGen CMO. And I'll tell you 2 really quick stories. And I'm just going to be as real with you as possible, because conversations are so much better that way. When I was 10 years old, I unfortunately lost my mom. And I remember in the aftermath of that, a couple hours after it, I was sort of emotionally exhausted, and I was thinking to myself, and it just dawned on me. And it was sort of an interesting thing to think about as a 10-year-old kid, but I told myself, like, go live a meaningful life, because she didn't have the chance to. And that's stuck with me ever since. And I've worked really hard to be associated with people I love and enjoy, and to work on things that I'm passionate about. 10 years after that, I was 20 years old, and this is story number 2. And I had an internship at Morgan Stanley in a wealth management division downtown Los Angeles. And I worked on a high net worth team. And I basically cold called rich people to try and convince them to allow us to manage their money. The job sucked. I hated it. But one day I struck up conversation over the phone with a lady who used to be a Superior Court judge in LA County. We had a wonderful conversation for about half an hour. We made plans for lunch. I thought, this is awesome. Okay, I'm kind of enjoying this. Hung up the phone, wrote down the details in the lead sheet, passed it over to the VP of our wealth management team. And I have to describe him. He was about 6'4", 6'5", 240 pounds, shaved head, former Navy SEAL sharpshooter. He was a big, intimidating person. Pretty typical of that sort of environment. And he looked at me. He said, "Who is that?" I told him, "Oh, she was a judge. She's got $7 million in assets, blah, blah, blah." He sort of shakes his head. He goes, "Don't call her back." And I paused for a second, right, because I felt defensive. I was like, nope. I built this rapport. I'm going to make this happen. And so I worked up the courage, and I looked at him, and I just said, "Why?" And he slammed his hand down, and pardon my language, but I need to repeat this because I think it wraps up the story. He slammed his hand down. He looked at me. He said, "Women are bitches, and bitches don't invest. Don't fucking call her." And I looked around the table, and nobody responded. And I finished up the workday, and I never went back. I quit. Because fuck him. Because fuck him and fuck those opinions. And, yeah, I would never tell him that to his face. But here I am now, it's 10, 12 years later, and I came across Wealthfront, and I believe in it, and it's worth it. And if you're going to be good at something as a chief marketing officer, if you really want to work on something from a growth perspective, like, know what your story is. Know what drives you in a particular direction. And don't let anyone else tell you it's not worth working on. Focus on that. And that's it. Thank you for your time.